Chapter 8 Windows. Kurt Lydon's study was locked, but that's not a major problem for a Cherub agent. Greg opened the door easily, using a straight pick attached to his lock gun. 2 bedrooms had been knocked together to create Kurt's workspace, and £30,000 had been invested in specialized computer equipment. 2 powerful Dell workstations hummed away inside a special cooling cabinet, and there was a huge inkjet plotter for making blueprints. One wall shelved thick books with titles like Advanced Molecular Thermodynamics and Mathematical Modeling for Turbulent Plumes and Jets. Pride of place went to a pair of 30-inch ultra-high resolution LCD panels, worth over $10,000 apiece. Beside Kurt's regular keyboard and mouse was a multi-buttoned spaceball controller designed for manipulating 3D images on screen. Andy had spent hours practicing with an identical system on Cherub campus, but still felt intimidated as he sank into Kurt Lydon's high-backed office chair. He tapped the spacebar and was pleased to see that the computer was only in standby, but the screen demanded a password. Greg was already on the case. He'd sneaked into the room on an after-school visit 2 weeks earlier and installed a hardware keylogger between the keyboard plug and the USB port on the back of Kurt's main computer. Keyloggers contain memory chips that record every keystroke entered into a computer. When the logger got back to the MI5 lab, it would hopefully reveal all sorts of information that Kurt had typed over the previous fortnight. But all they needed right now was Kurt's main password. Greg pulled a tiny laptop out of his backpack, plugged in the keylogger, and sat on the floor while the machine booted up. "We haven't got all night," Andy moaned. "Keep your wig on," Greg teased. "These tiny laptops aren't very powerful. It takes a couple of minutes to boot up, and there's diddly squat I can do about it." Andy hated waiting around. Missions were okay when his mind was occupied, but he had a nervous disposition, and waiting always made him start thinking about stuff that could go wrong. "Okay," Greg said, when he'd finally accessed the keylogger data. "First session, last Friday week. Capital AR, then lowercase Aristotle, followed by a hash, a percentage sign, and the numbers 5, 3, 1, and 8. Andy was relieved that Windows accepted the password. "I never would have guessed that one," he gasped as the desktop and taskbar appeared on screen. The screen was specifically designed for high-resolution work, which left the dozens of tiny icons looking like specks amidst the huge expanse of screen. Greg put his laptop on the carpet and passed Andy a ring binder and CD-ROM from his backpack. Andy placed the silver disc in a tray and let the Dell swallow it. A dialog box popped up on screen, and he clicked OK to install a forensic program designed by the security services known as Window Breaker. The program froze time, ensuring that no time and date stamps were left when files were altered. It also enabled a backdoor into the Windows operating system that bypassed most Windows security protocols. The second program on the CD was a Trojan horse. Once installed, MI5 would be able to access Kurt's computer, remotely reading his files and monitoring all activity. The instant the program was installed, Kurt's antivirus software flashed up a warning. Andy had fully expected this, and the third program on the CD dealt with it by installing a patch that made the antivirus turn a blind eye to the unwanted software. "Okay, that's the software installed," Andy smiled. "You'd better start hunting for the dreaded backups." Andy planned to spend most of the next 3 hours altering Kurt's centrifuge design so that it wouldn't work. Greg had to search the office and the rest of the house and overwrite any backup copies he could find with a doctored version of the original stolen file. But this left MI5 with two major headaches. First, if Kurt looked back at any previous versions of his work for any reason, he'd realize that the files had been tampered with. Second, there was no way of knowing whether Kurt had stashed an extra backup under the floorboards at a friend's house, or even in a safety deposit box on the other side of town. All MI5 could do about this was cross their fingers, not let Lydon out of sight, and move swiftly to arrest him if he began to suspect that he was under surveillance. Remember, Andy said, it's a 20 gigabyte file, so it won't fit on a memory stick or a DVD. You're only looking for backup hard drives. Greg sounded slightly irritated. I know, Andy. I read the briefing too. He started off by running a search on the hard drives of Kurt Lydon's twin servers as Andy opened Lydon's AutoCAD software and found the latest version of the centrifuge design. The 3D model comprised over 3,000 parts, and even on one of the fastest PCs available, it took nearly 2 minutes to load. Once Andy was sure that he'd opened the right file, he plugged a portable hard drive into the USB port on the front of the machine and made a duplicate copy. MI5 would study this file to establish how quickly Kurt was progressing with his simplified design. By the time this was finished, Greg had overwritten a file on the other PC and began searching drawers and shelves for backup drives. Andy now had to enter the alterations that would sabotage Kurt's redesign work. 143 parts had to be changed, and each one required up to a dozen individual alterations. It was impossible to remember all of these, so one of Lydon's former colleagues had made a checklist, complete with detailed instructions, screenshots, and even printouts of specific menus within the sophisticated software. It was delicate work. One decimal point in the wrong place could leave an obvious flaw in the design that would make Kurt Lydon suspicious and blow the whole operation. Andy put one hand over the spaceball and another over the keyboard before muttering "concentrate" to himself. He opened the ring binder and started to read Alteration 1, Locate Part Spacer Bearing 17. Andy navigated expertly with the spaceball, finding the part using the search tool, zooming in, and then changing the display properties so that the wireframe outline of his target part was the only thing on screen. Select the 4th and 6th sprocket holes, alter the thread properties from 1/16 of a millimeter to 1/18 of a millimeter, rotate the object in relation to the y-axis within the main design by 0.07 of a degree. It was brain-numbing stuff, and it wasn't helped by Greg humming as he rifled noisily through a filing cabinet. "Dude," Andy said fiercely, "shut up." Greg didn't appreciate the tone, but he'd seen the complexity of Andy's instructions and didn't envy his task. "Sorry, mate," he said. "I'll be done searching here in a minute anyway." 2 hours later, Andy sat at the giant screens rubbing tired eyes. Greg took a mouthful of Pepsi and popped a couple of M&Ms in his mouth. Greg had inspected the family PC and George's laptop, but the only centrifuge design he'd found was an original stored on a backup hard drive on top of a kitchen cabinet. To speed Andy's task, Greg now stood alongside with the ring binder, reading his instructions out loud. The operation wasn't going badly, and they were ahead of schedule, but the task required absolute concentration, and it was 3 hours past when they'd normally be in bed. "Alteration 100, Greg said, sounding slightly triumphant because they'd finally progressed to a 3-digit number. Open the sub-model of the motor unit G and alter the specification of the insulation." Greg didn't finish because his phone started to vibrate. It was their mission controller. "How's it going?" John asked. Not too shabby, Greg said. It doesn't look like Kurt's too thorough about backing up his data, and we should be finished inside an hour if we're not interrupted. Out of luck on that score, I'm afraid, John said. They're triangulating the position of Sophie Lydon's mobile phone in the control room on campus. She called for a cab a while back, and it looks like she'll be home in 6 to 8 minutes. Greg glanced at his watch and saw that it was only 1:30. Didn't you tell me that the club was open till 3? It might well be, John said, but you don't have to stay till closing time. Don't get discouraged. You've got all the equipment, and we made plans for an interruption. Wait until Sophie goes to sleep, then use the gas and the needle like with her mother. I know the plan, Greg said reluctantly, before tapping Andy on the shoulder. We'd better clear out. Oh, bloody Sophie, Andy complained as Greg snapped his phone shut. Would have been so much simpler if she'd waited till we were done. The two boys stuck all their stuff back inside their packs, hurried back into George's bedroom, and threw their sleeping bags out on the floor. Andy was tense, but he couldn't help but see the funny side of Zhang's loud snoring. It was less than 10 minutes, but it felt like ages before Sophie's key rattled in the front door. She hurried down the hallway and used the downstairs toilet before staggering upstairs, barefoot, with a bottle of Highland spring water in one hand and her black heels hanging from the other. Andy peeked out of the open doorway and saw that Sophie was drunk. Her head bopped to a tune in her mind, and she was murmuring the line of a song to herself over and over. Instead of heading into her own room, Sophie ratcheted up the tension by poking her head inside George's open door. Greg and Andy closed their eyes and kept dead still. The little geeks are sleeping, she muttered to herself before giggling. Sophie started to back out, but noticed Andy's bag of M&Ms and a half-drunk can of beer on the carpet. Mummy won't be happy if she sees that, little brother, Sophie grinned, before tilting the can to take a swig. Andy and Greg weren't sure if the can was drugged or alcohol-free, but it didn't really matter because they needed to get on with the operation and couldn't wait 2 hours to put Sophie to sleep. The beer was warm and flat, so Sophie spat it out in disgust. Greg opened one eye slightly and saw Sophie's painted toenails on the carpet just a few centimeters away from his face. I'll teach you to mess with Mr. Rabbit, Sophie slurred. Smiling mischievously, she poured Andy's M&Ms onto the carpet near the doorway and then crunched them under her heel. Once they were nicely mashed, she tipped the remainder of the beer onto the brightly coloured mess. Even if the liquid dried up by morning, a multicoloured stain and the distinctive smell of beer would remain. Talk your way out of that one, Georgie boy, Sophie said quietly. She gave her bum a jubilant wiggle and laughed drunkenly as she staggered out and grabbed the handle of her bedroom door, but it was still locked from earlier. Greg and Andy realised the same thing at the same time. George's mum had hidden the key so that the boys couldn't get back into Sophie's room. The only way Sophie could get into her room would be to ask her mum where the key was. And if Sophie went into her mum's room and found that she wouldn't wake up, she'd scream the house down. Chapter 9. Plans. There was a lot at stake. A corrupt scientist, a centrifuge design worth millions, the chance to infiltrate the highest levels of the Dark Sun network, and the opportunity to stop some crazed dictator or terrorist getting their hands on a nuclear bomb a few years down the line. Greg and Andy hoped some scenario from their training would leap out with a solution, but all they felt was blind panic as Sophie headed drunkenly down the hallway towards her mother's bedroom. "Try unlocking her door," Greg whispered to Andy as he darted out into the hallway. "Hey Sophie, what's up?" Sophie put a hand on her hip and looked at Greg as if he was something nasty on the bottom of her shoe. "Piss off back to bed," she tutted. "I saw what you just did with the M&Ms, Greg warned. "I had one eye open the whole time." Sophie shrugged. "My mum's never gonna believe you." "She might," Greg said, as he stopped walking half a meter from Sophie. He didn't have a clue what to say, so he blurted the first thing that came into his head. "I might forget all about it if you give us a quick snog." Sophie tutted incredulously. "Ugh, in your dreams, pervert." "Come on," Greg said. He was about the same height as Sophie, and he put his hand on her shoulder. "Just a quick Frenchie?" "Ugh!" Sophie shuddered before giving Greg a two-handed push. "Touch me again and I'll knock your block off." Down the hallway, Andy turned his body so that Sophie couldn't see what he was up to as he worked on her door with the lock gun. Sophie felt intimidated as she backed up towards the chest near the staircase. Greg was only 12, but he looked strong, and she knew that he'd seen off 2 Year 10 boys. Greg sensed Sophie's fear and took a step back. "I'm only messing," he said. "I'm not gonna hurt you." "Ta-da!" Andy said from down the hallway, throwing the lock gun back into George's room as he pushed Sophie's door open. "Sorted," Greg smiled as he looked down the hallway. "Now you don't need to wake your mum up." But the booze in Sophie's bloodstream made her paranoid, and Greg's attempt at blackmail, followed by a sudden eagerness to please, was totally creeping her out. The instant Greg turned to look back at Andy, she grabbed a vase off the cabinet at the top of the stairs. Greg saw it move out of the corner of his eye, but Sophie was fast and brought the vase down hard over the back of his head. It didn't break over his skull, but slipped from Sophie's grasp and shattered onto the wooden acorn at the top of the stair rail. "Keep your hands off me, weirdo!" Sophie screamed as she followed up with a remarkably well-aimed karate kick. Even 2 years of the best combat training can't protect you when you're taken by surprise. Greg doubled over and groaned with pain as Sophie stormed down the hallway towards Andy. "Where's the key?" Sophie demanded. "I swear if you guys have touched anything inside my room..." "There's no key," Andy said. "I just know how to pick locks." "Oh, you're so full of it!" Sophie screamed. She felt confident after flattening Greg and gave Andy an almighty shove. "Gimme my key!" Sophie shouted as she launched a full-fledged assault by trying to knee Andy in the stomach. Unlike Greg, Andy saw it coming. He sidestepped Sophie's flying knee, which was a good job because she was hefty, and it hit the passage wall so hard that it made a dent in the plasterboard. As Sophie groaned and clutched her agonized knee, Andy hooked his foot around Sophie's standing leg and swept it from under her. Andy stepped back, leaving Sophie glowering up at him from the floor. "I was trying to help," Andy said, trying to calm her down. "Why don't you just go to bed, eh?" But Sophie was having none of it, and she lunged forward and tried wrapping her arms around Andy's waist. Meantime, Greg was back on his feet. He felt an excruciating pain as he took his first step, but he ignored it as he sprinted down the hallway and dived into George's bedroom. Sophie was much heavier than Andy, but her karate skills were limited to a few self-defense classes, and Andy soon straddled her waist, pinning her arms to her side. "Please calm down," Andy said. "You're drunk. You'll feel better if you get in bed and try going to sleep. I want that key! She screamed. I don't want you little idiots in my room! Greg burrowed down the side pocket of Andy's pack and grabbed one of the syringes. Out in the hall, Sophie spat and wriggled, even though Andy had her hopelessly pinned. Get off me! She yelled. As soon as you calm down, Andy yelled back. It's a misunderstanding. I haven't got any key, I swear. Greg crouched down behind Andy. He put the syringe between his teeth before grabbing Sophie's foot and twisting it around so that it was flat to the floor. I'll kill you both! Sophie screamed, now close to tears. Let me go! Andy felt bad because Sophie was really upset, but she was going so crazy that he knew he'd only have to pin her again if he let her up. Greg took the needle and jabbed it into the flesh between two toes on Sophie's right foot. She felt something, but Andy's torso blocked her view, so she had no idea what it was. It took half a minute for the sedative to start working. Sophie stopped thrashing about and her body started to relax. Oh, thank Christ for that, Andy gasped breathlessly as he tried to stand up. But the mixture of nightclub cocktails, panic, and sedative hadn't done Sophie any good. As Andy lifted his weight off her stomach, she sat upright and spewed bright green vomit into his lap. Ah, shit, Andy gasped, heaving at the smell of the puke dripping off his thighs as Sophie crashed back onto the carpet, dead to the world. It's easy to choke when you're unconscious, and Andy's first aid training kicked in. He plunged his hand into Sophie's mouth and made sure that her airway was clear before standing up and rolling her into the recovery position. Who'd want to be a spy? Andy complained, clutching the strained muscles down his left side as he stepped back from Sophie. How come you never see James Bond covered in some drunk bird's puke? Greg wasn't listening because he had his own problems. He leaned against the wall, inspecting his right heel. He'd ignored the pain when the adrenaline was flowing, but now realized that he'd sliced his foot open on a chunk of the broken vase. What's more, he'd left a trail of blood all along the hallway carpet and into George's room too. Andy inspected the mess. Blood, puke, beer, broken china, half a bag of crushed M&Ms, and even a dent in the wall. Oh, George's old lady's gonna love this when she wakes up in the morning. Andy and Greg were both in pain, but they'd been through worse in Cherub training, and were both determined to pull off their mission. Greg looked up and smiled at Andy, then mimicked the gruff voice of a Cherub instructor. This is tough, but Cherubs are tougher, he said. Andy laughed, but that made the torn muscles in his stomach hurt even more. I'll take a shower and nick a clean pair of shorts from George's wardrobe, he said. You find a bandage or something to stop your foot from bleeding. Once we're cleaned up, we'll drag Sophie onto her bed. Fair enough, Greg nodded. Then what? Andy glanced at his watch. It's only 1:45. Nobody will be waking up for at least 3 hours. So we go back into Kurt's study, make the last 43 revisions to the centrifuge design, and then turn in for whatever's left of the night. Sounds like a plan to me, Greg nodded as he started hobbling towards the bathroom.